Good morning and good afternoon. A warm virtual welcome. My name is Suda David Wilp, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I'd like to welcome you to our 7th Transatlantic Tuesday. Today's Transatlantic Tuesday will be zooming in on the state of Wisconsin and what kind of influence that state will have in the upcoming presidential election. Before I hand it over to my colleague, Peter Sparding, who is a Transatlantic Fellow based in our DC office, I'd like to thank our Business Alliance partners, Bayer, Deloitte, Google, and Pfizer for support of this discussion. Enjoy the conversation and looking forward to seeing you at our next Transatlantic Tuesday. Peter, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Suda, for that introduction and also a warm welcome from me. Let me briefly talk a bit about the plan for this discussion so everybody knows what we're going to do. So we're going to have a brief 15-20 minutes kind of moderated conversation with me and our guest, and then we'll open it up for questions, and you can chime in either via the chat function in the Zoom system, or you can click on the raise your hand icon, and then we'll see that you want to ask a question. We can unmute you and you can introduce yourself and say or ask what you want to ask. And I should mention that this will be recorded, so in case you have any complicated questions, just so you know. Okay, with that out of the way, let me introduce our guest. We are very happy to be joined by Craig Gilbert this morning. Craig is the Washington bureau chief for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, which is the biggest newspaper in Wisconsin. And Craig is especially well suited to help us understand what's going on. He has covered not only Wisconsin politics, but national US politics and presidential campaigns for a long time. And you know, I've been a follower for a long time of his work. So thank you so much for joining us, Craig.
Great to be with you.
Great. So I think, you know, usually you write for a Wisconsin audience and explain and analyze what's happening nationally and, you know, try to make sense of things. But you kind of have a second job, I think, in that because there's such a high interest in the state of Wisconsin politically, you often find yourself explaining Wisconsin to national audiences, or in this case, even an international audience. And I think there's a good reason for that. You know, I personally find Wisconsin politics interesting in itself, but for many people, I assume the reason they are interested in Wisconsin and similar states is the big role it plays in electoral politics in the presidential elections. And, you know, that is kind of shown in that in many of the current forecasts, once again, it's one of the key battleground states. And in some, actually, it's known as the kind of the tipping point state. So maybe the state that might decide one way or the other who wins the presidency. And then on top of that, I think Wisconsin is also a good example of many developments we see broadly in the US. So the state in the small offers a window kind of, or a good example of broader developments. You know, you have polarization in the political polarization at a high level in Wisconsin. You have issues of economic inequality, of racial segregation and tension. So Wisconsin in many ways can function to give an idea of the broader debate going on. So I thought what we should do is start maybe with a look back, because the reason people know about or are so focused on Wisconsin this time is, of course, what happened in 2016. So Wisconsin, to recap, was part of this, what was called the blue wall of these Midwestern, upper Midwestern industrial states that were considered to be safe for the Democratic nominee. And it was assumed that Hillary Clinton would win. And then in the end, of course, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin flipped and voted for Donald Trump. And that was quite a shock for many people. I mean, in the case of Wisconsin, I think the last time it had voted for a Republican was 1984, if I'm not mistaken. So it's been a while. So I think, Greg, I'm sure you know this, there were a lot of international and national reporters that immediately went to places in Wisconsin to find out what happened there. And I know it's been debated endlessly since then, but I would like you to tell us what you think. Was it a matter of actually people flipping votes, you know, switching parties? Was it that turnout played a role?
Yeah, I think it was all those things. I mean, turnout certainly played a role in places like the city of Milwaukee, where there was clearly a big drop off in turnout that hurt Hillary Clinton. But in other kind of swingier parts of the state, it really was, we saw the so-called Obama Trump voter really play a role. In fact, there's about 1,900 communities in Wisconsin, and more than 500 of them voted for Obama in 2012 and then for Trump in 2016. Now, these are mostly small communities. They're kind of concentrated in Western Wisconsin, which tends to be kind of swingy. But that was the big shift, particularly among rural voters, among blue-collar white voters. The one nuance that I'll add about your kind of look at Wisconsin is that even though Obama really won two pretty easy elections in Wisconsin in 2008 and 2012, it was extremely close before that. George W. Bush only lost Wisconsin by less than a point in 2000 and less than a point in 2004. So it's been voting Democratic. It had been voting Democratic many times prior to 2016, but it was a competitive state. And it really is right there kind of on the front line of American politics. You'll find that Donald Trump's approval ratings are a little bit better in Wisconsin than they are nationally. But because of that, Wisconsin is right at that tipping point in the Electoral College.
Right. And just, and from your point of view, so I remember in 2012, if you look at the total votes, I believe Mitt Romney got more votes than what Donald Trump needed in 2000 or had in 2016, and which won him the state. So that many people pointed to was more of a turnout issue than for Democrats. So if I understood you correctly, there was a combination of swing voters in parts in the rural part, and then there was a turnout problem in the bigger Democratic strongholds. Is that the combination?
Well, there was a turnout problem specifically in Milwaukee.
Okay.
And there was a turnout issue in other communities. It was particularly significant and dramatic in Milwaukee. I mean, the other big Democratic city is Madison, and Madison and the area around Madison turned out like crazy in 2016. So they didn't have a turnout problem. In fact, Madison performed better for Hillary Clinton than it had even for Barack Obama. But you definitely had swing communities. You definitely had swing voters. You talk to these voters after the election, and a lot of them were voting against Hillary Clinton more than they were voting for Donald Trump. I mean, they were taking a chance on Donald Trump. You can't understate the kind of Clinton factor in the election as you look ahead to the November 2020 election when Donald Trump would be facing a different opponent.
Okay. So maybe we move one step further in our look back and look briefly at 2018, the midterms, because nationally, obviously, we saw a big swing towards the Democrats, and they took back the House of Representatives and got quite a big majority. And then in Wisconsin, they took back the governor's office, and the Democratic senator won her re-election campaign, but the race for governor was pretty close. So do you think the swing in Wisconsin, was it less pronounced than in the rest of the country?
Well, it depends on which race you look at. It's true that the campaign for governor was very close. So there really wasn't much of a swing when you're using that as the measuring stick. But there certainly was in the U.S. Senate race where the Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin won handily. And then, if you sort of look at the map, one reason it's hard to answer that question is because different things are happening in different parts of the state. I mean, we saw the big kind of shift in the landscape in 2016 in the Trump election when rural areas that had even those that had some history of voting Democratic swung heavily toward Trump. We saw suburban Republican communities perform less well for Trump than they had for Romney. And in 2018, you saw an extension of those trends where different things were happening. I mean, in rural Wisconsin, the Republican governor, Scott Walker, even though he lost statewide, actually did better in a lot of small towns in his losing election than he had done in his winning elections. And at the same time, he did significantly worse in the suburbs, including Republican suburbs, in this election That was where the big swing was. So we're seeing kind of cross currents on the map. They're really interesting going into this election. There's like multiple pieces to this puzzle.
Okay, and let me draw you out on this, because this, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, describes a bit of a trend we see maybe even in other parts of the country, where you have more rural areas and what often is categorized as non-college educated white voters becoming more Republican in their vote, whereas suburbia, so to speak, people in college educated, often voters, including white voters, becoming less Republican. Because I know that in the state of Milwaukee, the suburbs of Wisconsin, the suburbs of Milwaukee are, a big Republican stronghold. But as you just pointed out, they were a little less so. Do you think this is just a Trump phenomenon that happened this one time, or is this a general trend you've seen?
So the way I would put it is, one of the things that made Wisconsin distinctive and interesting in the past was that it kind of resisted to some degree these big national democratic trends you're talking about. I mean, there were rural parts of Wisconsin, not all the rural parts, but some rural parts of Wisconsin that were voting much more Democratic than rural voters were nationally. Really jumped off the map. Western Wisconsin, these rural counties along the Mississippi River that had consistently voted Democratic, white rural voters that were not as Republican as they were elsewhere. And then you also had, on the flip side, you had suburban Republican counties, like the ones outside Milwaukee, that were not trending in a Democratic direction, the way they were around most large metro areas in the US. So Wisconsin was kind of fighting those trends. And then what happened in 2016 was those trends took over, and in a big way. And you saw the rural swing to the Republican Party. You saw a suburban swing away from the Republican Party. So a big central key to the drama of 2020 is exactly what you were pointing to. Was 2016 a blip, or was it sort of a march in these powerful structural national trends? Are the Republican suburbs going to swing back at all for Donald Trump the way they voted in past elections? Are the rural areas in Wisconsin going to swing back at all to the Democrats? And I think, it's going to be a little bit of a mosaic. I mean, Wisconsin is a place where in Western Wisconsin, the rural counties are swingy. And in the midterms, we did see them swing back to the Democrats in some ways. But in other parts of Wisconsin, the rural areas are more conservative and more Republican. So this is all these are all pieces of the puzzle.
Got it. Okay, so let's maybe turn then to the current moment a bit. And what would you say, given the very unusual circumstances we are in right now, what issues are dominating the debate in Wisconsin when it comes to the upcoming election? Is it all about the coronavirus epidemic? Is that just kind of pushing everything else aside, or are there other issues? We obviously also have the current situation with the Black Lives Matter protest and so on. Can you help us? Is it just like in the rest of the country? Do you think there's something special going on in Wisconsin? Help us understand.
Yeah, so I think before the pandemic and before the protests, there were some issues you could point to that were particularly salient in Wisconsin. Just as one example, farming. Wisconsin's a big dairy state. Dairy farmers were really in distress. And a lot of these communities where dairy farming is critical to the local economy were places that had voted in big numbers for Donald Trump. But they were hurt for a while by Trump's trade policies. They were hurt by the weather. They were hurt by consolidation. A lot of big things were going on that were really, really creating distress in the farm economy. But in the current environment, I think it's true that the pandemic and to a lesser degree, the protests have really dominated. And we've seen the same kind of swing in Wisconsin, the same sort of deterioration in Donald Trump's numbers in Wisconsin that we've seen nationally, maybe not quite to the same extent, but this went from a small Biden advantage of maybe 2 to 4 points to what looks like an 8 or 9 point advantage for Joe Biden in Wisconsin. So Wisconsin's going to perform a little bit better than Donald Trump, probably than Donald Trump does in the national popular vote. But in this environment, states like Wisconsin that are really the so-called tipping point states don't look as competitive as they did 4 months ago.
Okay. And you attribute this then, as it seems, to the coronavirus and especially the response, or is that something that may have happened anyway? It's hard to tell.
No, I think the reason that I think you would not say it might have happened anyway is you look at how the governors have done in a lot of these states. And they've gotten much higher marks on handling the pandemic than the president has. So, a crisis is obviously a crisis, but it really does matter how it's handled. And we know from the polling that in Wisconsin and elsewhere, President Trump has gotten negative marks on his handling of the pandemic. So yes, that's a big deal. That's really, I think the main thing, and again, to a lesser degree, perhaps his handling of the protests, the drivers of his decline, kind of a modest decline in approval, but certainly a decline in his horse race numbers.
Okay, got it. In terms of, you mentioned this earlier, the trade policy, let me draw you out a bit on this because we probably have a number of European listeners in the audience, and that's something that people followed quite closely, in the last few years. President Trump's, of course, pretty aggressive trade agenda, mostly with China, but also looking at the European Union and the countermeasures that those, China and the EU have posed were often directed at states like Wisconsin.
Yes.
But it sounds to me, what you said, if his poll numbers were still somewhat, or at least not negative, that didn't seem to have an impact immediately, because I think a lot of people, from the outside look at this and think, well, if this is hurting farmers or others, manufacturers, why are people not turning away from this? Was there any impact of the trade war that you saw before this virus situation on his numbers?
Yeah, so I spent a fair amount of time traveling around Wisconsin, and some of that time talking to farmers in kind of farm communities. And, a classic situation you run into is, a farmer who voted for Trump and was hurting. But, maybe a farmer that agreed more with Republicans than Democrats on other issues. Maybe abortion, maybe taxes. And so a lot of those farmers were hurting. They were in distress, but they were also kind of waiting and hoping for their situation to improve. I have no doubt that it was costing him some, at least marginal level of support in these farm communities, but it wasn't generating a wholesale abandonment of the president.
Okay, so you would say that is the cultural issues, so to speak, often dominate the direct economic impact? Is that a fair assessment?
For a lot of voters, they do, and they have, absolutely.
Okay. All right, so maybe let's look at the current situation. So you already mentioned this, but I think if you look at, depending on which polling aggregator you look at, Joe Biden currently leads by 6 or 7 points in the polls. The polling, especially the state level polling in 2016, was famously off in some states, or something happened towards the end of the race. I don't know if you have an opinion on this, but if I remember correctly, in 2016, Hillary Clinton was leading in most, if not almost all polls right up to the election. And so there's this feeling among many people that they don't trust the polls or think they might be off again. What's your sense of where the race actually stands right now?
So as many of our listeners may know, the national polls were actually pretty accurate. The problem was in state polling, in the battlegrounds. In a lot of states, a lot of the polling wasn't waiting for education, which means they were capturing kind of a distorted picture of the electorate. They were getting a cross-section of voters that had a higher rate of college education than the actual voters did. And that skewed the polls toward the Democrats. And that wasn't the issue in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, what happened, what we think happened, and is certainly kind of seems clear from the exit polling, is that there were a lot of voters that went into the final week of the election that didn't like either candidate. They didn't like Trump, they didn't like Clinton. They were making up their minds at the end because they weren't happy with their choices, and they overwhelmingly went with Donald Trump. I think the numbers are pretty dramatic in Wisconsin on that score. So, so what happened was, the numbers changed after all the polling was concluded for that reason. It's a little different. I think it's always good. Let me just say, it's always good to be cautious about the polling, and it's always good not to assume today's poll is going to be tomorrow's result. But there are some differences between now and 2016. The biggest one, of course, is that Donald Trump's the incumbent. And he wasn't in 2016, and incumbent re-election campaigns tend to be, to a large degree, referenda on the incumbent president. So that kind of, I think, changes the picture for him. I think it gives him a little bit less hope that these numbers are just going to turn around like they did at the end of the last election. And of course, we're also in the midst of this great crisis, economic crisis, public health crisis. Don't assume anything from the polls, but don't assume that the same thing that happened in 2016 is going to happen in 2020 either.
Okay. So I'm just going to give a quick heads up to the audience. So we're going to open up in a little bit for some questions. So if you have any, press the hand icon or just put them in the chat. But let me ask you one question that maybe draws up a little bigger picture of the Midwest based on Wisconsin. So as I mentioned in the beginning, it was not only Wisconsin, it was Michigan and Pennsylvania as well that were the three states kind of famously breaking away from the Democrats out of this blue wall. Do you expect them to move in lockstep? So I know that the reason I'm asking is only Wisconsin gets this much attention. And I think I have the answer is, well, it is the closest one, but I'm kind of interested in your take on this. If you go on one of those websites where you can assign states with their electoral votes, you can play around. And if you take the exact same result from 2016 and move Pennsylvania and Michigan back to the Democrats, Donald Trump gets and keeps with, where Donald Trump keeps Wisconsin, he still has 270 electoral votes, which is enough. So unless Democrats get all three or some other state, it would be. So what's your take on this?
If nothing else changes, obviously Democrats have to win all three of those states, the three Great Lakes battlegrounds of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. I think one reason Wisconsin gets a lot of attention is a lot of people perceive Wisconsin as the hardest of those three states for Democrats to win back. I think they generally perceive Michigan as the easiest of those three states for Democrats to win back. And so that kind of leaves Wisconsin and Pennsylvania as the states that have probably the greatest potential to be tipping point states. Pennsylvania is bigger, but we don't know, it depends on kind of what order they end up in and which one is sort of better for Joe Biden and worse for Donald Trump than the other one. But those are the two states, I think, that are kind of closest to the tipping point of this election. Now, the other three top battlegrounds are Florida, Arizona, and North Carolina. And so we have a pretty defined list, I think, of 6 battlegrounds. And those are the communities that are getting most of the television advertising. And that's where the great bulk of the effort is going. And obviously, if a state like Florida flipped, it's so big, it would kind of change the math dramatically. But right now, those 3 states are really at the front lines. And Arizona, I would say, is another one to really keep an eye on because it's traveled further in its politics. It's gone from being a Republican state to being a purple state pretty quickly. And so if Arizona flips to the Democrats, then the Democrats obviously wouldn't even need to win Wisconsin.
Okay, let me just a quick follow-up. So is the reason that Wisconsin might be closer, is that demographic? Is the demographic makeup of the state slightly different than Michigan, Pennsylvania, or is it the history of the politics there, or is it just?
Well, it's a combination. I think demographics is part of the answer. We talk about this demographic, non-college whites, white voters that don't have a 4-year college degree. Well, they make up a majority of the electorate in Wisconsin, and so they're a bigger percentage of the vote in Wisconsin than any of the other top battlegrounds. So yeah, part of the answer is demographic, but it goes beyond that. I mean, Wisconsin is a place where Republicans have had more than their share of success at the state level in the last decade. I mean, they had a Republican governor that got voted out of office, but had won 3 elections before that. They've had some success in Senate races. They dominate the legislative level. And so it's a combination of the way Wisconsin's been performing and the fact that demographically it seems kind of tailor-made for Donald Trump in a lot of ways.
Okay, so there's already a number of good questions coming in, but I'll just add the final question from me for this. So thinking ahead, I mean, I should ask you who you think will win, but I know you are going to be cautious. So let me ask you more this way. There are some states in the upper Midwest that not too long ago were battleground states like Iowa and Ohio that are now considered almost safe for Republicans, or at least in normal circumstances. And then you have the others that you mentioned, Michigan and Pennsylvania and so on, that are still more Democratic leaning maybe. Is Wisconsin not only the tipping point state for the Electoral College, but could it in 10 years be one of the 2 sides? Is there a chance it might move completely into one of the sides, or?
There's always a chance. I mean, it has become less democratic. I mean, the polling shows that it used to be a state where Democrats might have had a 3 or 4 point advantage in the partisanship of the electorate, and now it's pretty 50-50. So it has moved. The question is whether it's going to continue to move. But again, there are cross currents. For example, the fastest growing part of Wisconsin is Madison and the area around Madison. Right. It's also the most liberal part of Wisconsin. So that's sort of functioned as a counterweight to what's happened in these small towns in northern and western Wisconsin. And we're also, what happens in those Republican suburban counties is also going to determine the answer to your question, because if they continue to fall off for the Republicans, then that's going to keep Wisconsin from going down the path of Iowa and Ohio as a blue-collar white state that falls out of reach for the Democratic Party.
Okay, got it. So we're going to start taking some questions. I'm going to start with someone who raised their hand so they could actually themselves state the question, maybe briefly introduce, and then I'll take some of the questions from the chat as well. So I'm going to start with Lincoln Mitchell. So if you could please introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for the great talk. My name is Lincoln Mitchell. I teach political science at Columbia in New York, but I've actually worked on campaigns in Wisconsin. I ran Kenosha County for Gore in 2000. So I have a little bit of knowledge of the state, but you got very much in the weeds in the horse race, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about voter suppression and how you expect that to impact the race in Wisconsin in the coming months.
So there are important issues when it comes to kind of the administration of the elections. Republicans who have been in charge of state government have made a lot of changes and imposed new kind of regulations and restrictions. Democrats feel that depresses their vote. Now, on top of everything else, we have the pandemic. And we saw Wisconsin has had 2 pandemic elections in April and in May. And we saw overnight a massive increase in the use of the mail ballot. In Wisconsin, you can cast an absentee ballot by mail, or you can do it in person during a small early window in the weeks before the election. In a normal Wisconsin election, about 5% of the ballots would be cast by mail. And in these April and May elections, it was, 2/3 of the ballots. And so there's an interesting partisan twist here. And that is, the mail ballot is something that both parties had always promoted, but with President Trump's kind of rhetoric about attacking voting by mail, there are Republicans that are actually concerned about whether that could depress the use of the mail absentee ballot by Republican voters and hurt them in the fall. So you've got Democratic concerns about, whether the window for early voting is big enough, whether people are going to get the support they need, whether Democratic complaints that we're not liberalizing the rules in a pandemic in the way we should. At the same time, you've got some Republican concerns that Republicans are going to be too wary about using the mail ballot, and that could depress their vote in a pandemic.
Great, thanks. I'm going to take a question here from the chat that Ryan Heath from Politico posted, and he's asking if there is, or what evidence there is that the Democrats are organizing in the African-American community in and around Milwaukee. He says to harness the demands of the Black Lives Matter movement to avoid the lack of energy and the turnout issue that we discussed earlier. Do you see any evidence of this? Or?
Well, I think it's certainly, I can't give you like an on the ground assessment because it's been a while since I was back on the ground in Milwaukee since the pandemic began. It is certainly a huge priority for Democrats. Everybody has kind of internalized the fact that, you know, if Hillary Clinton had replicated Barack Obama's 2012 numbers in the city of Milwaukee, he would have won Wisconsin in 2016. Now, that was never going to be an easy task, but it is it is on the high on the to-do list, high on the checklist for Democrats to do something about the decline in turnout that we saw in 2016 in the city of Milwaukee, and particularly in African-American neighborhoods. There's been some polling nationally that suggests that Joe Biden is actually doing not quite as well as Hillary Clinton among African-American voters, even though it's very, very lopsided. So all of that goes into the equation.
And just a follow on, to combine the two questions in a way, is there any evidence that voter suppression played a role in 2016 in the turnout in Milwaukee or not?
Well, it's a big subject of debate. And, you know, I think you can make a pretty good case that there was an impact. I think it's a little bit harder to make the case that it single-handedly swung the election from Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump. I've looked at the numbers. I spent a lot of time looking at those numbers. And again, you know, Hillary Clinton would have pretty much had to replicate, you know, Barack Obama's performance in 2012 in order to win in Milwaukee, in order to win the election. Barack Obama's performance in 2012 in Milwaukee was historically great. It was Barack Obama, the on the ground voter, you know, get out the vote effort was incredible. And so I don't think it was ever in the cards that Hillary Clinton was going to match what Barack Obama did in the city of Milwaukee. She certainly could have come closer than she did.
Right. Okay, let's take another question. I have Craig Charney here. So could you please introduce yourself and ask your question?
Thank you. My name is Craig Charney. I've been teaching political science at Bard, but I am a pollster by profession and have worked on campaigns here and abroad. I want to follow up on Lincoln's question and specifically focus on Milwaukee, because there, as I understand it, due to the extremely partisan role of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, they were forced to continue with the primary as scheduled, and the number of polling places was reduced from 180 to 5, and the turnout in this year's primary, that's what I'm speaking about, dropped by 40,000 votes compared to the previous primary. So I'm wondering if you think that the effect of COVID could well be, and a partisan Supreme Court or otherwise might be, to produce a similar turnout decline in live voting in Milwaukee, assuming that the COVID conditions continue. Because what I found particularly interesting, but I'm curious if this is right, is that since Milwaukee is a Democrat-dominated city, it must have been Democratic officials who decided in those health conditions that they had to reduce the number of polling places. Or am I wrong about that?
No, Democratic officials did reduce the number of polling places. They said, and for that reason, you know, Republicans have said, look, you know, Democrats did that themselves. Democrats have said, you know, we didn't have the ability to conduct this election in anything like the breadth of polling locations that we would have in a normal election. I think the evidence is mixed about the effect on turnout in April. I mean, actually, that turned out to be a very good election for Democrats. If you look at the top line race, which was a very politicized race for the state's highest court, the court we've been talking about.
But there was no contested Republican primary.
Right. So that, you know, there's no perfect corollary to compare. There's no great baseline to compare it to sort of make that comparison, because you had a very odd Democratic primary. I mean, the Democratic race, presidential primary, which is concurrent with the state elections, was all but over, but it was a primary as opposed to what was going on the Republican side. So it's hard to disentangle all that, but absolutely it's an issue, and it's a question, a meaningful question going into November.
Okay, I'm going to take another question here from the chat. So I'm doubtful that you're going to answer it directly, but I'm going to rephrase it a bit. So there's someone that's asking, for Democratic philanthropists, do you have any strategic advice? Is there something Democrats aren't doing that they should be? So I'm guessing as a journalist, you're not going to give party advice, but can you maybe talk about the Democratic effort? I mean, famously, as you mentioned earlier, in 2016, Hillary Clinton didn't even visit Wisconsin in the campaign. So clearly, this has been identified as a mistake. Obviously, the pandemic makes these normal campaign events different, but I have seen, I think, that there's been a lot of effort since 2016 for the Democrats to change their ground game and so on. Can you talk a bit about what you've seen there,
Yeah. Well, I mean, Democrats would have to be brain dead not to make those changes in this cycle after what happened. You know, not only did Hillary Clinton not visit Wisconsin in the general election, but they didn't really advertise on television until the final week. Wesleyan recently did a study where they looked at the broadcast television by market in May and June. And Green Bay, Wisconsin was the #2 market in the country for presidential election ads. Milwaukee, I think La Crosse, Wisconsin, I think was #6, and Milwaukee was #9. So, you know, that list was dominated by the 3 states we've been talking about and Florida, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Florida. So they're clearly, you know, trying to do things differently. They're trying, after taking a beating, so, you know, quote, up north in Wisconsin. They're certainly paying a lot of lip service to making a much bigger effort in, you know, small town Wisconsin and northern Wisconsin and western Wisconsin. They're certainly, you know, talking about doing a lot more in Milwaukee. They're trying to kind of continue these inroads into the suburban areas, the Republican suburban areas around Milwaukee. You know, there were all these smaller cities in Wisconsin, I just wrote about them, that didn't get the attention Milwaukee got, but small blue collar cities like Janesville, Superior, Prairie du Chien, Kenosha, where Hillary Clinton just dramatically underperformed past Democratic performance. And those cities together had a more profound impact on the election than Milwaukee did. Those cities have been swinging back toward the Democrats in the midterms and even some of the ensuing elections since then. I think, you know, for Democrats, obviously, you know, they're trying to repair and rejuvenate the party in places where they've been badly eroding, and they're trying to take advantage of the opening they have in some of these Republican-leaning suburban areas.
And just to add, I mean, I think the Democratic convention was supposed to be in Milwaukee, right? The nominating convention.
So that's the other thing that, you know, you couldn't have asked Democrats to do much more than actually locating their convention in Wisconsin and in Milwaukee. Now, of course, the pandemic has intervened, and this convention is going to be a shadow of its former self. That said, Joe Biden has said he plans to come to Milwaukee to accept the nomination. And, you know, Democrats will try to kind of salvage some symbolic value out of placing their convention in Milwaukee and Wisconsin, even though it's really going to be a virtual convention.
Yeah. Okay, so I have one more question here in the chat, which is there's someone asking, given the large number of people losing employment and therefore the health insurance right now, what role does the debate around universal health care or healthcare in general, I would add, play in Wisconsin in this election or in general?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what role healthcare takes on in this election. I mean, on the one hand, it's obviously a very big deal in general, but also with respect to the, you know, people's situations in the pandemic. Healthcare is on the front lines of this crisis, and some people are losing their healthcare. At the same time, you know, we're not in the middle of a great legislative debate about, like we were when Obamacare and when repeal of Obamacare was being debated in Congress, which really elevated the issue of healthcare in a unique way during those kind of election windows. So I think it's a little bit of a question mark, you know, what role healthcare is going to play in this election. Okay, so maybe, you know, we're almost at the end of this virtual event. To look ahead at the next few months, we obviously have a very strange situation with the campaign, as we already discussed. It's not going to be as it normally is. And at the same time, everything is dominated by the coronavirus. Do you, knowing what you know right now, and is there anything that the campaigns really are going to do over the next 3 months that might change things in Wisconsin, or is it that they're basically at the mercy of whatever the economy and the health situation will develop? It's such an unusual situation that I'm kind of wondering, the normal thing like ground game and so on,
in voter registration. Is that still going to be decisive in the next week? I mean, obviously they're still
So,
doing it. But
yeah, I think, broadly speaking, everybody's at the mercy of events and conditions. But on the margins, there are things that the party can do and the candidates can do and will try to do if this is a really close election in the end. And all those things will matter. I mean, television advertising, you're not going to have the same kind of person-to-person organizing. But what they do digitally is going to matter. We've talked about the role that election administration could take, and when it comes to absentee voting, the state has agreed to mail absentee ballot applications to most voters, which is an encouragement to vote by mail. But these are big question marks, and these are things that certainly could matter. Wisconsin has been decided by less than a point in 3 of the last 5 presidential elections. So when you're talking about an election that's decided by, in one case, 5,000 votes, in one case, 11,000 votes, in one case, 22,000 votes, then it's easy to find things that matter, even small things.
Okay, so I know you're probably not going to make a prediction, but maybe, do you think that Wisconsin will be the tipping point state?
I think if it is a close electoral contest, it doesn't look that close right now, but if it gets back to being a close electoral contest, I think either Wisconsin or Pennsylvania will end up as the tipping point state.
Okay, great. Well, I think we've answered all the questions in the chat and from people on the call. So I think we can wrap it up here on time. Thank you so much, Craig, for joining us. If Wisconsin is the tipping point state, I will ask that you come back and explain things. If not, you can also come back, of course. But we would love to have you explain what actually happened in the end. Thank you so much.
Thanks. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us.